In 1979, 2 sets of remains were discovered off a highway in Northern California. Investigators believed they were looking at a teenage boy and girl, but they were wrong. The victims weren't a boy and girl at all. They were 2 teenage girls who had vanished months earlier, just 90 miles away. And because of that mistake, their identities would remain unknown for nearly 37 years, even though their families had reported them missing. It would take decades and advances in forensic technology before investigators finally learned who the girls were. But by then, the trail had gone cold. This is the story of Kerry Graham and Francine Trimble, 2 best friends who left home one day in December 1978 and never came back. And for nearly 4 decades, their case remained one of Northern California's most haunting unidentified cases. Before we continue, if you're new here, my name's Amanda, and this is Their Voice Matters, where we tell true crime stories with clarity and care, always centering the people whose voices deserve to be heard. If that matters to you, I'd love to have you here, so please subscribe to the channel or follow the podcast. It really does help these stories reach more people. On the afternoon of July 8th, 1979, a couple from Sacramento was driving along Highway 20 in Northern California on their way to Fort Bragg on the California coast. At some point during the drive, they got into an argument and decided to pull off the road to take a break from each other. The man stepped out of the car and walked down a steep embankment near James Creek, thick brush surrounding him as he tried to cool off. About halfway down the slope, something caught his eye. It was a human skull. In that quiet stretch of roadside forest, what had begun as an ordinary disagreement had turned into something far more serious. There were no cell phones, no quick way to call 911. The couple placed a soda can near the roadside to mark the location, then drove around 12 miles or 19 kilometers to Willits to report to police what they had found. When authorities arrived at the scene, they would realize this wasn't just a single set of remains, and it wouldn't be a simple identification. Mendocino County Sheriff's deputies and a detective responded to the scene. What they found was the scattered, unclothed remains of not one, but 2 individuals. Both had been bound with duct tape, concealed within plastic, and buried in a shallow grave. Over the next 2 days, investigators searched the area extensively, ultimately recovering approximately 90% of the remains. Many of the bones had been displaced, likely due to animal scavenging. There was little additional evidence at the scene, but one small item stood out: a single earring, a bird carved from shell. At the time, it offered no clear answers, but it was one of the only personal items recovered from the grave. Investigators believed the victims had been killed elsewhere and transported to this remote location, but determining who they were would prove to be incredibly difficult. This was 1979. DNA was not available as an investigative tool. That breakthrough was still years away from entering mainstream forensic use. There were no centralized missing person databases as we know them today. No digital cross-checking, no social media amplification. If no one came forward to claim them, these 2 victims could remain nameless. At first, investigators focused on what the remains themselves could reveal. The remains were transported to the coroner's office for forensic examination. Investigators hoped the bones might reveal who these individuals were, or at least how they died. The coroner determined that both victims were between 10 and 20 years old, likely around 14, and had been deceased since approximately December 1978, 7 months before their discovery. Determining whether the victims were male or female proved far more difficult. In cases involving children and adolescents, skeletal differences between males and females are not always pronounced, particularly before full puberty. Forensic anthropologists relied heavily on bone structure and physical markers, methods that are not infallible. After further examination, they concluded that one victim was male and one was female. The victim identified as female was estimated to be between 5'3" and 6 feet, or 160 to 180 centimeters, but likely around 5'5.5", or 166 centimeters, and between 10 and 20 years old, possibly no older than 14. Her remains were found with the single bird-shaped shell earring. The other victim, identified as male, was estimated to be between 5'2" and 5'11", or 157 to 180 centimeters, but likely around 5'5", or 165 centimeters, and between 10 and 20 years old, possibly no older than 13. This individual had light brown hair and teeth in excellent condition, with no fillings. Both were believed to be Caucasian, though examiners noted they could not be completely certain. Due to the condition of the remains, a definitive cause of death could not be determined, but strangulation could not be ruled out. However, the manner of burial, bound, wrapped in plastic, and concealed, made it clear this was a homicide. Early forensic analysis also suggested that it was, quote, highly probable that the two were biologically related. That conclusion, combined with the belief that one victim was male and one was female, would significantly influence the direction of this investigation for decades. Detectives began searching for missing siblings. When no matches were found, they expanded on the theory. Some investigators speculated the two may have been a runaway teenage couple, possibly from the Midwest, who had hitchhiked to California. But that theory was based largely on process of elimination. In 1979, there were no national searchable databases, no digital cross-referencing systems, and no rapid interstate communication networks like those used today. When early searches for missing teens turned up nothing, options became limited. Investigators found no matching reports of two siblings missing from the same family. There also weren't any matches for a teenage girl and a teenage boy who matched the forensic estimates. Without names, without confirmed origins, and without additional evidence from the scene, the case stalled. The two victims were buried at Russian River Cemetery in Ukiah as John and Jane Doe. In 1985, much of the physical evidence was sent to the FBI for further examination. Still, no identification was made. Clay facial reconstructions were created and distributed to the media, hoping someone would recognize them. No one did. For more than 20 years, the case remained dormant, until, unexpectedly, a confession would briefly bring it back to life. In 2000, more than 2 decades after the remains were discovered, the case suddenly resurfaced. An inmate in New Jersey confessed to killing the two unidentified teens. Law enforcement took the claim seriously. The remains were exhumed, and DNA testing, which hadn't been available in 1979, was ordered. For the first time, investigators would be able to analyze genetic material. But the confession quickly unraveled. Records showed the inmate would have been just 12 years old in 1978 and had never left New Jersey. Investigators concluded he had likely seen media coverage of the case and inserted himself into it. The confession was a dead end, but the exhumation was not. For the first time, detectives now had a DNA profile for both victims, something that simply hadn't been possible 2 decades earlier. The DNA was submitted for comparison. No matches were found. However, with the remains re-examined, new questions emerged. A forensic odontologist, Jim Wood, reviewed the case and determined the two victims' jaw structures and dental patterns were too dissimilar to be biological siblings. He also challenged the earlier biological sex determination, concluding that both victims were likely female. Mitochondrial DNA testing confirmed that the two were not maternally related, though it wasn't able to determine their biological sex. The original theory that the victims were siblings began to collapse. But without names and without database matches, the case remained stalled. Investigators were left with an updated understanding of who the victims were not, but they still didn't know who they were. For years, the case sat with updated forensic conclusions, but no names attached, until a documentary would bring the case into public view. In 2011, the BBC partnered with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to feature a case in a documentary series called Naming the Dead, which focused on how modern technology could help identify unidentified child homicide victims. The remains were exhumed again. Using CT scans of the skulls, forensic imaging specialist Joe Mullins created digital facial reconstructions. Based on skeletal analysis available at the time, he produced images of one male and one female between approximately 13 and 15 years old. The reconstructions brought renewed attention to the case. Meanwhile, the victim's DNA was sent to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification for further testing. During this re-examination, investigators discovered something unexpected. A tooth that did not belong to either victim had been included with the remains. It has never been identified. Whether it belonged to another victim, the perpetrator, or is completely unrelated to the case remains unknown. Even with the updated testing and renewed media exposure, no immediate identification was made. But sometime after the documentary aired, authorities received a call. A woman believed one of the unidentified victims might be her sister, and that the other could be her sister's friend. The two girls had disappeared in December 1978 from Forestville in Sonoma County, California. DNA testing was conducted again in November 2015, comparing the remains to samples provided by potential family members. This time, there was a match. Investigators finally knew who the victims were, and they were not a teenage boy and girl. They were two teenage girls. Joel Mullins later addressed the earlier gender misidentification, explaining that the facial reconstructions were built from the skeletal structure provided to him at the time. He said, quote, "My images are only as good as the information I have in front of me, but that face still goes on that skull." Reflecting on the identification, he added, quote, "It's been such a collaborative effort giving these victims back their names, an identity that has been lost for 30 plus years. It's extraordinary that we were able to help the investigation and these families find answers to their questions. I can't sum up how incredible that is. I feel that my job has meaning." In February 2016, the Mendocino and Sonoma County Sheriff's Offices held a joint press conference. The unidentified remains found off Highway 20 in 1979 were officially identified as 15-year-old Kerry Graham and 14-year-old Francine Trimble, who had disappeared in mid-December 1978. The small shell earring recovered at the scene decades earlier was confirmed to have belonged to Francine. For more than 37 years, the girls had been buried under placeholder names. Now they had their own again. So, who were Kerry Graham and Francine Trimble? Kerry Ann Graham was born on November 12, 1963, in Orange County, California. She was the youngest of 3 children with an older brother and sister. Her family was considered financially stable and fairly well established. However, both Kerry and her brother were known to run away during their teenage years, something that would later shape how her disappearance was interpreted. Kerry was described as bright, outgoing, and confident. She had a strong personality and wasn't afraid to stand out. Francine Marie Trimble was born on September 27, 1964, in Novato, California. She had one older brother. Her home life looked different from Kerry's. Her father reportedly left before she was born, and the two were not close. Her family struggled financially at times, and it has been reported that she spent a short period of time in foster care. Francine was described as sweet, quiet, and reserved, softer in personality than Kerry, but deeply loyal to her friends. Kerry and Francine lived next door to each other in Forestville, California, a small, rural, unincorporated community with a population of roughly 1,500 to 2,000 people in the late 1970s. Forestville was about an hour and a half north of San Francisco, but it felt far removed from city life. There was no public transportation at the time. If you didn't have access to a car, you hitchhiked, and many teenagers did. Kerry and Francine had been friends since elementary school. Though they were in different grades, Kerry, a freshman in high school, Francine in 8th grade, they were inseparable. It also wasn't unusual for them to skip school together. By mid-December 1978, Kerry was 15 and Francine was 14 years old. One day, they would leave home together and never return. That day, Kerry told her mother they were going to Coddingtown Mall in Santa Rosa, about 10 miles east of Forestville, to do some Christmas shopping. It's unclear how they had planned to get there. Their families had not arranged transportation. Later, some school friends would offer a different account. They said the girls had mentioned plans to go to a party instead. One classmate recalled seeing Kerry and Francine in the parking lot of El Molino High School, where Kerry was a freshman. According to her, neither girl attended class that day, though she said that wasn't unusual. She remembered the girls mentioning they planned to hitchhike to a party in Santa Rosa, rather than going to the mall as they had told their parents. She said she had been invited to go with them, but she chose not to. Another friend later reported seeing the girls hitchhiking from a local gas station, a common pickup spot for teenagers in Forestville at the time. Whether the girls intended to go to the mall, to a party, or both remains unknown. There's no confirmed record of them arriving at either location. What is known is this is the last day anyone reported seeing them alive. Former classmate Eileen Getz later reflected on how small the community was at the time. She said, quote, "If 10 people drove by, 7 of them knew you. But who stopped that day and where the girls ultimately went has never been confirmed." When the girls didn't return home, their families responded differently. By the following day, Francine's mother had filed a missing person report with the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office. Kerry was not reported missing until December 24th. That delay has often been attributed to her history of running away. The exact date the girls disappeared is unclear. Some sources list Saturday, December 16th, but classmates later recalled seeing the girls at school the day they disappeared, creating confusion about the timeline. And some family members have suggested the girls may have already been out of school for Christmas break. What is clear is that by late December, both families knew something was wrong. Investigators did open separate cases for the girls' disappearances, but both were categorized as runaways. Family members pushed back. They told law enforcement they believed the girls had not left voluntarily. Neither girl had packed makeup, clothing, or personal belongings. Kerry had recently undergone an appendectomy and was still recovering, and she was on antibiotics, medication that she did not take with her. Francine's mother said she did not believe the girls planned to leave home. At one point, she feared something had happened inside the house itself, though there were no signs of forced entry at either residence. Despite these concerns, the runaway classification remained. To understand why, it helps to understand the time. In the late 1970s, teenage independence was viewed differently than it is today. Hitchhiking was common in rural communities. Short-term runaways were not unusual. And in many jurisdictions, missing teenagers were presumed to have left voluntarily, unless there was immediate evidence of violence. There were no Amber Alerts, no centralized digital databases, and no rapid interstate communication networks. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children wouldn't be founded until 1984. As Kerry's mother, Margaret Graham, later said, quote, "If a child didn't come back, they assumed they ran away. You have to remember how long ago that was. Kids were doing their own thing." Within that framework, cases like Kerry's and Francine's were handled much differently than they may be today. But without confirmed sightings at the mall or at a party, and without clear evidence of an abduction, the investigation quickly lost momentum. And with few leads to follow, the case stalled for decades, until new technology and renewed attention finally brought it back to life. With the girls finally identified in 2016, investigators were able to reopen the case with a new focus. For the first time, detectives knew who the victims were, but the identity of their killer remained a mystery. Now they needed to understand what had happened in the hours before the girls disappeared. At the time, Mendocino County Sheriff Tom Allman confirmed the investigation was active. He said, quote, "We're hoping somebody out there knows something. We really don't know what we're looking for. There's lots of theories and leads." Detectives believed that identifying Kerry and Francine could help fill in the missing pieces of their final day. Detective Quincy Cromer emphasized that identification was only the beginning. He said, quote, "We're not satisfied with identification. We are dedicated to finding out what happened." He added that knowing who the girls were could open new investigative paths. He said, quote, "This is a big step in this case. It opens up all sorts of possible avenues." Sheriff Allman also acknowledged the role of the BBC documentary and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in bringing renewed attention to the case. He said, quote, "We very much appreciate the BBC and NCMEC for getting this started and refocusing the Sheriff's Office on this case. We now need to know what happened in the 24 hours before they went missing." But even with their identities restored and the investigation reopened, the most important questions remained unanswered. Who picked up the girls that day? And what happened after? As investigators revisited the case with fresh eyes, they also began looking back at the early investigation and the factors that may have complicated it. Some of the original law enforcement reports were handwritten and only partially legible. This made it difficult for later investigators to reconstruct the early timeline of the case. Even the exact date the girls disappeared was not clearly documented. Without clear records and without the digital systems investigators rely on today, piecing together what had happened in December 1978 became far more challenging. Another major complication came from the original forensic analysis. The remains that would later be identified as Kerry Graham's were initially determined to be male. Investigators therefore believed the victims were a teenage boy and girl. Two missing teenage girls from the same town were not even on investigators' radar. Height estimates also differed significantly from reality. The remains belonging to Kerry were estimated to be around 5'5", when in fact she had been much smaller, around 4'9". Whether a correct identification of both victims as female, or even an unknown NF female, would have led to earlier identification is impossible to know. But the initial classification significantly shaped the direction of the search. At the time, the girls' disappearances weren't widely publicized. With the case categorized as likely runaways, there were no major public alerts, and several former classmates later said they were never formally informed that the girls were missing. After the girls were finally identified in 2016, several former classmates spoke publicly about the case. Some said they never realized the girls were considered missing at the time. Others said they were never contacted by investigators, despite having potential information about the girls' plans that day. One former friend, Eileen Getz, said, quote, "What breaks my heart is no one ever asked." Another classmate, Kathy Cully, said, quote, "How did we not know about this disappearance of two girls from very small schools and a very small town?" Ken Jones, a retired teacher who had taught both girls at Forestville School, said, quote, "No one I have talked to can remember anything about the girls turning up missing. This case was actually recommended to me by one of you, someone who attended school in Forestville at the time. They wrote, quote, no one in the school was notified. No students interviewed or warned. We all hitchhiked as there was no public transportation and the nearest stores were 15 miles away. Sonoma County didn't start public transportation until 1980. My high school friends and I talk about how easily we could have ended up like Kerry and Francine. They added that they hadn't known Kerry personally, that she ran with a different crowd, but in hindsight, it's difficult to not imagine how easily any teenager in that environment could have been vulnerable. It's also been reported that there was no mention of the girl's disappearance in the local newspaper at the time. In a community as small as Forestville, some believe that early conversations with classmates might have helped clarify where the girls intended to go that day, or who they planned to meet. Whether that information would have changed the course of the investigation is impossible to say, but those conversations never happened. In the years since the girls were identified, there has been speculation about who could be responsible. Some have pointed to the fact that several serial killers were active in California during the late 1970s, and the girls had been hitchhiking, something that has been linked to other crimes from that era. However, investigators have never publicly named a suspect or connected the case to any known offender. Today, the murders of Kerry Graham and Francine Trimble remain unsolved. More than 40 years after their deaths, investigators are still hoping that someone may come forward with information that could finally explain what happened. After the girls were finally identified, their remains were released to their surviving family members for burial. Although Kerry and Francine had been missing for nearly 4 decades, their families said the grief felt immediate. Kerry's brother, Ron, described the news simply as, quote, a shock. Francine's uncle, Will Walsh, said it felt, quote, as if it just happened. He explained, quote, we had resigned ourselves to never knowing why they disappeared. As you might imagine, it's just like learning of the death, as though it just happened. We miss Francine and regret deeply that she never had a chance at a good life. It would be really wonderful to solve this case. Even after all these years, the families are still searching for answers. If you have any information about what happened to Kerry Graham and Francine Trimble, or about their movements on the day they disappeared in December 1978, investigators are asking you to come forward. You can contact the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office tip line at 707-234-2100. Even small details, something remembered decades later, could help investigators understand what happened to these 2 girls. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What part of this case stood out to you the most? If you grew up in Northern California in the late 1970s or early 1980s and remember hearing about this case, I'd love to hear your perspective as well. And as always, if there are other cases you think deserve more attention, you're always welcome to suggest them in the comments. I love looking into cases recommended by viewers just like this one. If you want to help bring attention to cases just like this one, please like the video and subscribe to the channel or follow the podcast. It really does help these stories reach more people. Cases like this raise difficult questions about how early assumptions can shape an entire investigation. If you'd like to check out another case where those early hours really mattered, I recommend checking out my episode on Jonathan Huang, a missing autistic man from Washington State. His disappearance has raised similar concerns about how quickly cases are taken seriously. I'll link that video here and in the description. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring, because these stories matter. I'll see you in the next episode.